Imagine waking up inside a civilization that doesn't have a name for itself yet. The word Greek doesn't exist. The word Greece doesn't exist. What exists is a collection of a few hundred small, fiercely independent communities scattered across a mountainous peninsula, a chain of islands, and the coastlines of 3 continents. Communities that speak related dialects, worship overlapping gods, and share a loose cultural memory of a much older world that collapsed 3 centuries ago and left almost nothing behind. It is 800 BC. The great palaces of the Mycenaean civilization have been rubble for 400 years. The linear B writing system that once tracked livestock and weapons in precise bureaucratic inventories has been completely forgotten. The population has shrunk dramatically. Long-distance trade has nearly disappeared. What survived the collapse is agriculture, local community, oral poetry, and a stubborn human tendency to organize. What happens over the next 320 years is one of the most concentrated bursts of civilization building in human history. The Greeks, a people who don't yet call themselves that, will invent the city-state as a political form. They will spread colonies from Spain to the Black Sea. They will create the first written law codes. They will develop the phalanx, the trireme, the alphabet, red figure pottery, monumental sculpture, lyric poetry, and the first philosophical tradition. They will produce Homer's epics, Sappho's songs, and Solon's constitutional reforms. And they will end this period by defeating the largest empire on Earth, twice, at Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis. All of that happens in the Archaic period, the period historians used to call a prelude to classical Greece. The period scholars are now recognizing as a revolution in its own right. This is what it actually looked like. Subscribe, hit the bell, drop a like, and let's go back to the moment Western civilization decided to become itself. The single most consequential political invention of the ancient world was not democracy. It was the polis, the Greek city-state, and it was invented during the Archaic period by communities that had no model to copy and no guarantee it would work. The Archaic period began with a massive increase in the Greek population and significant changes that rendered the Greek world at the end of the 8th century entirely unrecognizable from its beginning. According to Anthony Snodgrass, the Archaic period was bounded by 2 revolutions in the Greek world. It began with a structural revolution that drew the political map of the Greek world and established the polis, the distinctively Greek city-states. What triggered this structural revolution? The most honest answer is population pressure combined with geography. During the so-called Greek Dark Ages, before the Archaic period, people lived scattered throughout Greece in small farming villages. As they grew larger, these villages began to evolve. Some built walls, most built a marketplace, an agora, and a community meeting place. They developed governments and organized their citizens according to some sort of constitution or set of laws. They raised armies and collected taxes. The geography of Greece made fragmentation almost inevitable. Mountains divided communities from their neighbors. The sea connected them to the wider world, but also to strangers. Every valley, every island, every coastal headland became the natural territory of a specific community. And each community developed its own institutions, its own calendar, its own patron deity, its own version of what it meant to be a citizen. The polis, or city-state, became the central political unit in Greece during the Archaic period. Its emergence was driven by urbanization and the amalgamation of smaller settlements, leading to the development of distinct constitutions and legal systems. Draco introduced a severe legal code in 621 BCE to replace private vengeance with state-administered justice. Solon, appointed in 594 BCE, implemented constitutional reforms that redefined political participation based on wealth, established the Council of the 400, and laid the groundwork for Athenian democracy. This is the political revolution that everything else depends on. Not the content of any specific law, but the idea that a community should be governed by laws at all, that the rules should be written down, publicly displayed, and applicable to everyone, including the powerful. That idea, which seems obvious to us because we inherited it, was genuinely new in 621 BCE, when Draco had his laws carved in stone in Athens, and it would have been unthinkable a century earlier. By the end of the Archaic period, both the Athenian and Spartan constitutions seemed to have developed into their classical forms. The machine of Western democratic governance was essentially assembled during these 3 centuries, and the people assembling it were mostly farmers and craftsmen who were making it up as they went. If the invention of the polis was the political miracle of the Archaic period, the Great Colonization was its geographical expression, and it transformed the Mediterranean world in ways that no single empire could have matched. Between 750 BC and 600 BC, Greek colonies sprang up from the Mediterranean to Asia Minor, from North Africa to the coast of the Black Sea. By the end of the 7th century BC, there were more than 1,500 colonial polis. The driving force was simple and brutal: land hunger. Land was the most important source of wealth in the city-states. It was also, obviously, in finite supply. The pressure of population growth pushed many men away from their home polis and into sparsely populated areas around Greece and the Aegean. Climatic changes between 850 and 750 BCE, making the region cooler and wetter, encouraged population growth and overseas colonization. The population of the Greek world roughly doubled during the 8th century BCE, and there was simply not enough arable land in Greece's mountainous terrain to feed everyone. Aristotle said that the poor with their wives and children were enslaved to the rich and had no political rights, leading to conflict between the nobles and the people for a long time. Emigration was one way to relieve some of this tension. The colonization process was organized and deliberate, not random. Usually about 200 men from an overcrowded city-state would set out to establish a colony elsewhere. Once they had set down some roots, they would bring their women, mothers, wives, daughters, to the new colony. Each colony carried a sacred flame from the mother city and maintained sentimental and commercial ties with its origin, but was politically independent from day one. Unlike Roman colonies, Greek colonies were not connected politically to the city-state from which they came. The cultural consequences were extraordinary. Greek settlements at Almina on the Syrian coast brought Greeks into direct contact with Phoenician merchants and Near Eastern artistic traditions. Greek colonization alleviated population pressures at home and disseminated Greek culture, art, and political ideas throughout the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions, significantly influencing local societies and contributing to the cultural cohesion of the Greek world. The colonies in Sicily and southern Italy, Magna Graecia, Greater Greece, became so wealthy and culturally sophisticated that they rivaled the mainland cities. Syracuse, Acragas, and Sybaris were not provincial outposts. They were major centers of Greek civilization in their own right. And through these networks of trade and migration, the alphabet, the phalanx, coinage, and the idea of citizen self-governance spread outward, not through conquest, but through the quiet, persistent expansion of people who brought their entire civilization with them. By 600 BC, the Greeks had planted over 1,500 independent city-states across the Mediterranean, without a central government, without an empire, without anyone telling them where to go. Drop a comment. Which Greek colony location surprises you most? I want to read your answers before we get to the military revolution that changed everything. The political story of archaic Greece is often reduced to a clean progression from aristocracy to democracy. But the actual path was far messier, far more interesting, and ran directly through a figure that the modern world has completely misunderstood: the tyrant. Many cities throughout Greece came under the rule of autocratic leaders called tyrants. The term tyrant did not initially carry the later sense of cruelty. It described a ruler who governed without hereditary legitimacy. Understanding why tyrants emerged requires understanding the economic earthquake that hit the Greek world in the mid-7th century BCE. The invention of coinage. A turning point in commerce came with the first coinage of silver in the mid-7th century. Coinage was introduced in the mid-6th century BCE, originating in Lydia around 650 BCE. Before coinage, wealth was land. Whoever controlled the land controlled politics. Whoever didn't own land had no power and no voice. Coinage broke that equation. Trade in goods such as pottery, cloth, wine, and metalwork made some people, usually not members of the old aristocracy, very wealthy. These people resented the unchecked power of the oligarchs and banded together, sometimes with the aid of heavily armed soldiers called hoplites, to put new leaders in charge. These leaders were known as tyrants. The earliest tyrants, Cypselus of Corinth, who seized power around 657 BCE, Orthagoras of Sicyon, Pisistratos of Athens, were not monsters. They were, in most cases, skilled politicians who understood that their power rested on popular support rather than inherited privilege. In Corinth, Cypselus consolidated authority by weakening aristocratic rivals and promoting trade. In Athens, Pisistratos strengthened central authority while supporting religious festivals and public works. Tyrants often relied on popular support. They disrupted elite monopolies and sponsored cultural development. Some tyrants turned out to be enlightened leaders. Phaedon of Argos established an orderly system of weights and measures, for instance, while Theogamnes of Megara brought running water to his city. The paradox of tyranny in the Archaic period is that it was simultaneously a symptom of the political system's failure and one of the mechanisms that produced democracy. Tyrants could have used grants of citizenship to poor or disenfranchised men as a means of marshaling popular support for their regimes. By breaking the aristocratic monopoly on power, even temporarily, tyrants created the political space in which broader participation became conceivable. When the tyrants were eventually expelled, the communities they left behind were not willing to simply hand power back to the old elite. The economy evolved with the introduction of coinage around the mid-7th century BCE, facilitating trade and manufacturing alongside agriculture. This economic shift contributed to the emergence of a middle class and changes in governance. The middle class that coinage created was the social foundation on which both tyranny and, eventually, democracy rested. And it was also the social group that equipped itself with bronze armor and changed the nature of warfare entirely. Around 700 BCE, a new type of soldier appeared on Greek battlefields. And his arrival was not just a military development, it was a political earthquake in slow motion. In the Archaic period, the most significant military development was the adoption of hoplite warfare by the Greek states. This occurred in the early part of the 7th century BC. The hoplite was a heavily armored infantryman who fought in a formation called the phalanx. Heavily armored infantrymen fought in tight phalanx formation, relying on discipline and cooperation rather than aristocratic cavalry charges. The equipment, bronze helmet, breastplate, greaves, a large round shield called the aspis, a long spear, and a short sword, was expensive enough that only men of moderate wealth could afford it. But it was not so expensive that only aristocrats could own it. Hoplites often supplied their own equipment. This requirement broadened military participation beyond narrow aristocratic circles. Political power slowly expanded in tandem with military contribution. Citizens who defended the polis demanded a voice within it. The phalanx formation itself encoded a political philosophy. Greek military leaders trained the heavily armed hoplite soldiers to fight in a massive formation. Standing shoulder to shoulder, the men were protected by their neighbor's shield. The aristocratic model of warfare, individual champions fighting duels while everyone else watched, was replaced by a formation that depended entirely on every man holding his position. Your survival depended on the man to your left. His survival depended on you. The man next to you in the phalanx was a farmer, a craftsman, a merchant, not a nobleman. And yet his shield was the only thing between you and the enemy's spear. It is almost impossible to maintain, after years of fighting in that formation, the conviction that the man next to you deserves no political voice because he doesn't own enough land. In Sparta, hoplite discipline became the organizing principle of society. The Spartan system, which produced the most feared infantry in the ancient world, was essentially the hoplite ethos taken to its logical extreme. Every male citizen was a professional soldier from age 7, and the entire social structure was organized to produce and sustain the phalanx. Helots, enslaved Messenians, did the agricultural labor that freed Spartan citizens to train exclusively for war. By the late 6th century BCE, Greek poleis had matured into complex political communities. Some adopted oligarchies. Others moved toward broader participation. Athens would soon develop radical democracy after expelling its tyrants. The military and political revolutions were inseparable. The same forces that changed who fought for the city changed who governed it. The Archaic period ends with a test so severe that it would have destroyed most civilizations. And the fact that the Greeks not only survived it, but emerged stronger, is the best argument for what the previous 3 centuries had actually built. The Persian Empire of Darius I was the largest political structure the world had yet seen, stretching from the Aegean coast of Asia Minor to the Indus Valley, from Egypt to the Caspian Sea. It administered dozens of conquered peoples through a sophisticated system of satraps and tribute. When Darius turned his attention to the Greek mainland in 490 BCE, following the Greek-supported Ionian Revolt, in which Athens and Eretria had helped burn the Persian administrative capital at Sardis, he was not sending a punitive expedition against a significant military power. He was swatting an annoyance. Vastly outnumbered by a fierce contingent of Persian troops, the Athenians, aided only by a small contingent from Plataea, scored an incredible victory at Marathon. The Persians lost more than 6,400 men. The Athenians suffered 192 casualties. Marathon was not just a military victory, it was an ideological statement. A citizen militia of farmers and craftsmen, fighting in a formation that expressed the political values of their community, had defeated the professional army of the world's greatest empire. The phalanx had worked. The polis had worked. The 3 centuries of experiment that the Archaic period represented had produced something that could actually defend itself. When Greeks united against the Persian Empire, they defended not only territory, but a new political model rooted in citizenship and autonomy. 10 years later, Darius's son Xerxes came back with an army so large that ancient sources estimated it at over 1 million men. A figure modern historians revised downward, but still acknowledge was the largest force ever assembled in the ancient world to that point. The coalition of 31 Greek city-states that met this army, states that spent most of the Archaic period fighting each other, held the pass at Thermopylae long enough to evacuate Athens, destroyed the Persian navy at Salamis, and finished the Persian army at Plataea. The Archaic period ended with the intellectual revolution of the Classical period. But what made the Classical revolution possible? Athenian democracy, Sophoclean tragedy, Socratic philosophy, the Parthenon, was the 300 years of structural, economic, military, and cultural invention that preceded it. The Archaic period didn't build a civilization. It built the conditions under which a civilization could decide what it wanted to become. That decision produced the world we still, in many ways, live inside. 320 years. From scattered Dark Age villages to a coalition that stopped the Persian Empire at the edge of Europe. From oral tradition to written law. From aristocratic cavalry to citizen phalanxes. From bartering to coin money. From local shrine to pan-Hellenic sanctuary. From king to tyrant to, in Athens, improbably, democracy. The Archaic period is the most underrated chapter in Western history. Not because what happened next wasn't extraordinary. The Classical period is everything the textbooks say it is. But because what happened during the Archaic period is what made everything else possible. The Greeks of the Archaic period were doing what all the great civilizational moments require, working out, through trial and error, and violence and genius, what kind of community they wanted to be. They didn't get it right every time. Draco's laws were so harsh that we still use his name as an adjective for cruelty. The tyrants who broke one elite's monopoly often built another. The colonies that spread Greek culture also spread Greek warfare. But the experiment worked. The structural revolution that Anthony Snodgrass identified at the opening of the Archaic period, the one that drew the political map of the Greek world, produced 3 centuries later the people who stood at Marathon and decided that the map was worth defending. If this video reframed a period of history you thought you knew, drop a like, share it with someone who loves ancient history, and click the next video on screen. It was chosen specifically for people who made it all the way to the end of this one.